Steve, thank you so much for joining us today to be the keynote at our Revitalization Summit. We are so excited to have you here.
Well, thank you, Brittany. It is an honor to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and hello to everyone who is attending the summit.
Amazing. Well, we always like to kick off, just like our podcast, learning more about our guest. Tell us a little bit more about who Steve is. You know, we can read your resume on Wikipedia, which, by the way, I was like, I want a Wikipedia page. He's got one. One day I'll have one, but I didn't get to see too much about your background, your personal life. So why don't you just tell our guests a little bit about what they wouldn't be able to find online about who you are?
Yeah, you bet. So I came from a family of folks who didn't go to college, who were their forebears, their parents were immigrants to this country. And a major focus for my family was service and education to advance in one's life. So that was really instilled in me. I had three sisters growing up, and we grew up outside of Philadelphia. And from an early age, although initially I wanted to be a fireman, but realized I probably didn't have the physical attributes to do that, decided that I wanted to be a doctor, and it became a passion of mine because certainly it aligns education and service. And that has been sort of North Star. Those have been North Stars for me throughout my career. So trying to be a lifelong learner and trying to serve others as best as possible. So that's how I started in medicine. And I got my training in internal medicine, then medical oncology, and then in radiation oncology, and had a sort of very varied career. And, one of the things that I think has been sort of a highlight for me in my career is that I've tried to overcome fear of making changes and doing new things. That a lot of times people stay where they are because, it's very comfortable. But clearly things like moving from Penn to MD Anderson, and then MD Anderson to the FDA, and now into the private sector. And it's been good. It's been great experience. Many of the challenges and issues remain constant regardless of the setting. But I think that's been a really important part of my career, facing challenges and doing the best to overcome them.
I think that scientists and doctors could really be used in all industries because of the scientific method and the way that we are humble when data shows that we're wrong. We're quite excited about that in the weird way. So I totally agree with you that attitude of service and asking good data-driven questions could be useful in any industry. You're a family man too, right? You have some kids.
Yep. So, and I was thinking as you were speaking that, Steve Hanh didn't say that. That's bad. We have 4 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls. Been married to my wife, the love of my life, for 39 years. She has done a beautiful job of raising our kids, and we now have 2 of the 4 who are married, and we have 2 grandkids, and hopefully more on the way. And just a wonderful time being together as a family. So really the most important thing in my life is my family, and just terrific. And by the way, a mixed breed dog that also is like one of my kids and goes everywhere with me.
I love dogs. I had to kick mine out of the office for today. I was like, Mommy's interviewing someone very important. So I was like, go in your crates and don't make a noise. Those big dog lovers.
You probably heard mine in the background. So yeah.
We always say behind every very successful man is a very busy woman, who has helped him do that. So kudos to Steve Hahn's wife, wherever you are today. Shout out to you.
Yeah. Well, for sure. And I certainly wouldn't have been able to take care of patients, sick patients, etc. I didn't have a great partner in my wife, for sure. And I think the other part of it is, and we'll probably touch on this, we know in medicine that women are the drivers of decision-making in healthcare. As a doctor, I always knew that. I mean, almost to the exclusion of anybody else, for kids, for grandkids, for, whoever. And my wife certainly fulfilled that role, even for me as a provider of care. So it's more than that, obviously. And I think 100% of the credit for the success of our kids and our family goes to my wife.
I wonder if women are also the predominant decision maker in our pets' health as well. Something tells me potentially.
Well, for sure. Although my wife describes me as the primary caregiver for our dog because we're attached like this, but
Oh.
she reminds me when I need to do things. So really, yeah, I'm a
Well,
paper tiger.
let's dive a little bit more into your background, because I saw that you attended medical school before the NIH enacted the Revitalization Act, which required women to be in clinical trials. And now somebody listening to this may be like, oh my God, is this guy ancient? No, you're not ancient. It was literally only 30 years ago that females were reinvited into clinical trials in the United States. And so when you were in medical school, were women really just considered small men? Was there any discussion about the impact of sex on health? Or just tell me about your training.
Yeah, Brittany, I actually think it was the middle thing you said, which is it really wasn't discussed.
Mm.
Sure, we talked about reproductive health, pregnancy, those sort of issues. We had OBGYN rotations, et cetera. But talking about it as a distinct entity. So let's take an example. There are really interesting and important data emerging about the effect of gender. So a woman's what happens to women with heart failure and how it is probably distinctly different than men. And we probably did most of our studies and our work with clinical trials that involve men predominantly rather than women. And so we've got to relearn a lot of what we know about disease pathophysiology, response to therapies, et cetera, and do that with really rigorous scientific data. So I'd tell you this, it wasn't that someone said, because we actually had a fair number of women in my medical school class, as well as underrepresented individuals as well at Temple University, which was something they were very proud of, and I am as well, even way back then in the 80s. But it wasn't really discussed as a distinct entity. And that's where I think we're really making some progress now, is that now we're thinking about it. And so the company I lead, Harbinger Health, which is a cancer screening company, blood-based, which really goes to the heart of what causes cancer in the genome. And it's based upon methylation. So changes in the chromosomes and the genes that turn off and on certain genes that lead to cancer. So we know that there are gender-based ethnic, racial differences in this. And it's been a topic we haven't wanted to talk about. It was taboo to some extent. But we absolutely have to understand this, because we won't get people better and we won't be inclusive of everyone until we understand that. And that starts with certainly having a conversation with folks, but also including people in the clinical studies.
Yeah. I mean, my PhD, I finished it, I think in 2016. And I mean, I don't remember any lectures about how do you consider sex in your biological experiments. You know, there's a class that we took my first year of grad school where it's like experimental planning. And it's really like the very rigorous training of controls and, you know, variables and how do you control for different things. Never once did they bring up sex or gender. Like, oh, by the way, always ask what cell lines, is it female or male? Or by the way, if you're doing all your tests in male mice, you should acknowledge that in your research or at least think about it, right? No, never. I never once came across that or heard that. And I mean, I went to fantastic school. And so I think that we are, like you're saying, even for you in med school, there was a lot of women. My genetics PhD class, we had predominantly females that were accepted, which was awesome. And yet the classroom content wasn't updated yet. Right.
It's really
and so
very interesting, that dichotomy there between who's in the room and what's the conversation about.
That's right. Well, after you working in medicine, you became the FDA Commissioner. Was that something that was in your diary, your goals, your vision board to be the FDA Commissioner?
So no. And when I interview the young folks who come to our company, I ask that stupid question. So what are your career plans? And that's not really a stupid question, because I want to understand where people are going. But I always tell them, look, it's okay if you're not sure where you're going, because I never knew I was going to be chief medical executive at MD Anderson Cancer Center. I never knew I was going to be, commissioner of food and drugs. I didn't know I was going to be at Flagship Pioneering or heading up Harbinger Health. You just don't know. And that's what I meant when I sort of introduced my career path, was that, to some extent, people see that as risk, but taking risks to do new things. So no, I didn't know. That was not in my career plan. I had always done clinical research, and a significant proportion of my clinical time was in mostly clinical, but some translational laboratory research. And so I always was involved in that. I had several INDs with the FDA. So I kind of understood that from the provider and researcher end of it. But it was a very steep learning curve to go into a setting where the legal, regulatory, and clinical aspects are so complex and interweaved. And of course, you throw COVID on top of that, the learning curve was even steeper during that period of time. But it was a great opportunity to serve the American people, and I was happy to do it.
It was definitely a service. You were nominated for a commissioner by former President Trump on November 1st, 2019. You were sworn in December 17th, 2019. And we all know what was happening at that time with COVID-19, kind of being in China and Asia and then getting over to Europe. And we were still kind of like, America was like, ostrich head in the sand a little bit at that point still. You were getting sworn in. Were you aware of this impending pandemic? Like, did you have a sense of like, oh, wow, this is a career defining like moment, or tell us about that?
Yeah, no, it was. So when you go through this process, you interview with the senators because they're the ones that decide on your confirmation. I probably met with 60 senators. I mean, I'm guessing at the number, but face-to-face meetings, this topic was not brought up once. I was never asked by the press. And really, it wasn't until I was in the seat in January that it became a thing. Ironically enough, this I haven't told anyone this actually. I had the flu in December, and I, in that retrospect, said, "Oh, was that early COVID?" And I had antibodies tested, and personal health information. Sorry, but no, my numbers weren't up, so probably didn't have it. But that was the whole point, is it wasn't even in the differential diagnosis of a doctor back in December. So it wasn't on the radar. It was vaping, youth use of, inhaled tobacco products. It was opioid epidemic. It was all those other issues that had come to the fore, CBD, rather than this. But it hit, and it hit us hard, as you know. And by the end of January, FDA had stood up an emergency response because we knew then what was happening in China and then ultimately in Europe.
Well, I have so many questions. We have limited time. I would love to read your book one day if you're writing one about what that experience was like. But let's dive into a little bit about the female component here in the pandemic. So the Pan American Health Organization reported that while women were overwhelmingly less likely to develop severe COVID than men, they were also more likely to be diagnosed later, though. And once they were diagnosed, they died earlier, suggesting that many did not receive timely and adequate care. Were these trends in differences in gender and sex that the FDA was aware of? And what do you think the cause of women being diagnosed later was?
Yeah, I think to answer the second question first, my guess, so first off, we were always, as a world, but certainly as a country, playing catch up on the data. And it's one of the things that really needs to be fixed around the world, but particularly in the US. Our data systems for public health are very antiquated. Deb Burks hired students to collect data from hospitals around the country, centered in the White House. So you think about that, right? We don't really have the systems in place to know how many people are admitted every day with COVID. So again, there's a lag between who gets admitted, who's diagnosed, et cetera. And remember also, we didn't have a diagnostic test initially. Yeah. And so that we didn't know who was getting COVID except for when they actually got it. So this was not top of mind with respect to the gender-based issues that you just described. However, the ethnic and racial differences soon became very important because in a lot of ethnic groups, multi-generational households are common. Look, my family was Italian, first generation, grandfather living with the mom and the dad and the kids. That was very, very common. And it happens today in the US, particularly in immigrant communities. And that had a significant public health effect. So for good or for bad, and for bad, I think for the most part, playing catch up on data is a problem. Like, for example, we know that now in retrospect that there were a lot of cases in other parts of the world, say China, that we didn't really know about. So we didn't know, for example, when it first started, that people under the age of 35 could be asymptomatic. That's very different from flu, right?
Yeah.
And so and this is not to blame anybody, but they're carriers. And they're hugging mom who might be on chemotherapy. And so, or going to the nursing home, right? And not knowing they have the virus or the disease. So this playing catch up really led to the fact that we were not aware of the gender differences that you described. And it wasn't until later when we started talking to folks around vaccines and therapeutics that we started asking and answering some of the questions around, are there going to be gender-based differences? Who needs to be included in the clinical trials? What about pregnant women? What about women who are breastfeeding, et cetera? And so there was a deliberate attempt to try to answer those questions. Although I will tell you, the most important thing was getting products into the community, into the hands of the provider, to keep our health system from being overwhelmed and to keep people from dying.
That's right. Before we get into the vaccine and clinical trial discussion, which I'm very excited about, I want to just tap quickly on that point you were bringing up about the lack of data, that data gap. It's funny because we talk about that all the time in women's health, that we lack basic data sets as to what is average for women. Everyone's walking around saying 28-day menstrual cycle. Only 16% of women have a 28-day menstrual cycle. So when you're normal,
me.
Yeah. And so, I mean, when you consider normal as something that less than 20% of women experience, all like 80% of women think they're abnormal, right? And then when you try to calculate fertility windows or time to menopause, like if you don't know that normal or average cycle length, all of that gets messed up. And so I guess I want to ask you about if there's a data gap between hospitals or public health systems reporting it to the government. Do you think that, not only for urgent responses in terms of like, a pandemic, something that's happening right here, right now, but do you also think that there's a data gap in what they're reporting on in terms of sex and gender? Is that even part of those reports? Like, are they including how many women are coming in versus female or male, or what the difference in sex, results were based on what condition they had? Or tell me a little bit about that.
The data reporting, the basic data reporting includes gender, ethnicity, race, et cetera. So those should be available. The fault there is the actual reporting and how long it takes. It's a very slow process. It's not ideal, and it needs to change. No question about it. The good news is, I believe in the EHR, the data are there for us to do the analyses you just described. And so we need to get the data. We need to figure out a way to do it in a safe, compliant, private way that protects people's personal health information, but still not put obstacles in the way to do those analyses. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So we would want to ask the question, sifting through a large amount of data, what are the underlying risk factors for a severe disease? What are the underlying variables that go into someone coming in late for care, et cetera, whether they be health related or they be socioeconomic, or frankly, things like transportation, how many subway stops you are away from the hospital, which in some studies is shown to be a significant factor. The problem is aggregating that data and then doing the analyses. So if there's one thing that you all can do, it's really advocating for our having a very comprehensive ability to aggregate these data and do the analyses. Other countries do it. There's no reason why we can't. There's very rich data out there that's going to allow us and point us in the right direction. You all have the hypotheses and the questions, and then we just need to have the data aggregated. One last comment about what you said, because it's like stuck in my craw. So it always bothered me. Okay, you can look at a lab test. It's normal. It's not normal. There's a threshold, et cetera. But when we say what you have is normal versus abnormal, that it's almost nonsensical if you understand clinical medicine, right? And in biology, there is a spectrum, and that is normal. That's normal.
That's normal. Yeah.
That's normal. And so the lexicon has to change so that people aren't confused by that. Because your point about menstrual cycle length, think about a 16-year-old young lady thinking she's abnormal and not really understanding and not having anybody she can go to talk about that.
Yeah. And the implications of what normal is. So we'll use cervical dilation in labor. Maybe for Black women, they dilate at this speed. And so therefore stop giving them C-sections. She is normal on her spectrum, right? Or, really understanding that dilation or labor doesn't happen exactly like this. And so if it goes off course, you need to do surgery, right? That doesn't need to be the case.
And I really do. Those are great examples. And and another example is, what's the appropriate breast cancer therapy for different ethnic and racial groups? Because we know that there are different responses to therapies, and that there are, potentially different toxicities. We've known that for years in certain subsets of cancers. So what it really takes, and I don't think it's doctors sitting around, we don't want to know that. I think it's, you're going into a busy clinic, there's like a million pieces of data in front of you. Someone in academia, in the government, wherever, what we need to do is aggregate those data, and we need to do the analyses and figure it out. Because once you have, and I think AI and ML, if we used appropriately, and here's another point, if the inputs are appropriate, because if the data sets are biased against women, ethnic minorities, and certain racial groups, that's going to be a problem. So we have to keep an eye on these things and make sure that we're not biasing those data sets. But I do think AI and ML will help us put all that together.
Well, wait for our future AI summit. I'm sure that will be next year's topic, probably, right? Because of how much is changing so quickly. But speaking of the data, even if you have the data, you try to analyze it, you need to also make sure you ask the right questions in the first place to get that data. And so my next question for you is concerning the impact of COVID-19 vaccine on women's menstrual cycles. So, I know from my own experience, I remember I was like a 30-year-old healthy single woman working from home. I was literally the last person to get a vaccine. Like, I was not qualified till like the very end to finally go get my vaccine, which is fine, right? That's what it was. But that whole time I was starting to hear stories about women getting really heavy menstrual flows, or them skipping for a few months, or, and I just saw blogs online, and, as a FemTech expert, people were asking me, I said, I don't know what this is. So tell us a little bit behind the scenes. Did the FDA ask questions about women's menstrual cycles, and if they changed in the COVID-19 vaccine? I guess I'll ask that first. Was it asked?
Yeah, and the answer is no. And one of the reasons it's no is because our statutory responsibility is around assessing the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, et cetera. It doesn't mean we weren't interested in it, because in fact, what we would do as we revised our clinical trials guidance is make sure that we were cognizant that those questions needed to be asked. So typically in the federal government, that's a joint effort between CDC and FDA, with what CDC is doing from analysis would inform what we're doing. Now, when we did vaccines, and we'll talk about it, we wanted to know the answer to that question. We wanted to know, how would the vaccine, for example, affect menstrual cycle, the ability to get pregnant, et cetera? How would it affect a pregnant woman? And our clinical trial, well, we'll get into that, but there were a lot of interesting questions that came up. But I think you're bringing up a really important point that I just want to throw out to get your reaction to, and maybe your audience. You said something really interesting, which is sort of an almost crowdsourcing of people asking questions. And so part of it is going to your provider and asking that question. But remember, your provider is one human being who is taught what they're taught, and may not have the data to adequately answer it. And it isn't until we have this sort of crowdsourcing of, hey, I want to know the answer to this question, that people who actually are asking the questions can say, that is a really great idea. And so I'm thinking about the role of your organization and others about this. If there's another way to fill that deficit, yes. But at the FDA, when I first came there, one of my important 3 top goals was, let's listen to the consumer, the patient, and the provider. What are they trying to say to us? What's important to them? As we make our regulatory decisions, let's make sure that that's addressing their really important questions that they have about this. And so I think that what I would like to do is link what you said to the fact that what's important to your community. And then let's get that on the table, and let's start asking those questions.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like my job is just to travel the world and fly a flag that says, was sex considered? That's my job, like, and a lot of times the answer is like, oops, no, thank you. Like, we should relook at that. Do you think, though, that menstrual cycles would be considered like a vital sign, and should it be necessarily something that's like, oh, that's a good idea, but rather like, from here forward, we should probably just assume that's a vital sign of women and we should ask? Because I know when I go to the doctor, they always say, what was the last day, the last day of your last period, and I'm like, if all the clinical trials had that question, which I get asked every time I see my doctor, right, we could potentially figure out what phase they were in when they got their vaccine.
I think it's a terrific idea. And I love the way that you put this as a vital sign. And maybe there's a different lexicon that makes sense, but I think that because I'm going to say it's a sensitive barometer most likely, but it's a multifactorial, if you will, barometer.
Yeah.
And both of those things are really good. It's like heart rate.
Yeah.
There's some data that suggests that changes in heart rate precede a serious illness, and probably in COVID as well. But we're not looking at that. So why wouldn't we use all the data to actually help us make, say, okay, we now need to, this is a clue that we need to look to.
That's right. Something I've learned about in my many webinars I've attended was one of the easiest ways to diagnose osteoporosis is to not ask your patients what their height is, but just take their height, because you can actually track over the years that predominantly she is shrinking, right? And so like there's these easy vital signs that if we just asked or did the test, we could actually be diagnosing disease or finding out if there is some systemic thing happening. Maybe it is stress, maybe it's, an autoimmune disease, but we won't know if we're not asking about these vital signs. Do you think that the change in menstrual cycles that some women experience from the COVID-19 affected vaccine adherence?
I'm not aware of any data to suggest that. It could, as a matter of fact, I think, and I'll use the term vaccine hesitancy, not in a derogatory, but just people have legitimate concerns about how it could affect their health. And it wouldn't surprise me if someone linked, changes in menstrual cycle to COVID and then said, wow, this wasn't studied adequately. How do I know that this is the right thing for me? And, I have some personal anecdotes about that. My daughter was breastfeeding and then pregnant during this entire, situation. And we had a lot of conversations about it. And there were 100% admission to her that there were a lot of data gaps. And it's like anything else, the data gaps aren't great, but you make the best decisions you can. And most doctors really care about their patients, and they're going to try to do the best they can. But the lack of information is problematic. It gets us back to where we were before. How can we do that in real time?
Yeah.
And we should be doing that in real time. And I'll give you another example from the pandemic. So we did emergency use authorization. It was very interesting how the term EUA became part of the American lexicon.
Yeah, I was like, a what? Oh, yeah. Everyone just go for your emergency and get a PPP loan. Okay.
Exactly.
Those are two things everyone needs to apply for.
Well, it's too funny, isn't it? Yeah. I spent a lot of time talking about that authority and what it meant. And what it meant was we didn't need the full extent of the data information to authorize something if we thought the risks were much lower than the benefits or were lower and that it justified it. And of course, the calculation is different for a nasal swab than it is for a vaccine, which is a preventative. So we have to factor that in at the agency. But take diagnostic tests, for example. We wanted to get them on the market quickly. We realized that by doing that, based upon a limited data set, that they would have to be revised. So we set up a system where data from the actual use of those tests in the real world could come back to us and the sponsor, and we could revise the way that test was done, the performance characteristics, so that we could make it better in real time. So I'm asking myself the question as you and I are talking, if we can do that in real time with EUA, if we can do that in real time with other decisions that we make, why can't we do that in public health? Why can't we accept data like a doctor, make the best decision you can with the initial data, be honest and upfront people about the gaps, fill those gaps in, and then come back and say, hey, we're going to change our recommendation to you because we have more data now.
That's right.
That's the way the system should work, in my opinion. But people will argue about it.
Well, it kind of reminds me of the Ambien case where women for about 20 years were getting in car accidents in the next morning because their metabolism metabolizes Ambien slower than the male. And it took 20 years, though, for it to be retracted and then re-prescribed based on sex-specific dosages. And to my understanding, that's the first and only drug that's been like that. And so I think there's a lot of little old ladies out there that are overdosed because they're not being adequately, prescribed the stuff for their sex and their size.
Well, here's another piece of advice, what you can take it or leave it for the organization. And that is, as we think about accelerated approval of drugs, vaccines, et cetera, probably more drugs than anything at the FDA, Commissioner Califf, who's a real expert in real world evidence, has really been at the forefront of saying, we're going to require you to gather real world evidence. So why is that important? Because no matter how hard we try to be inclusive in a clinical trial, because of the fact it has internal validity, we're strict about the criteria for entry, it won't have the generalizability to specific subgroups. So what you must do is you must subject whatever you're looking at for regulatory approval to the real world. And it's there that you're going to identify particular subgroups where it may or may not be helpful, or if there's additional study that needs to be done. We just have to not only encourage, really make it part of the process that people are looking at this with respect to, sex, with respect to, ethnicity, with respect to race, because it applies to all of that. And the other part of this that's probably true is socioeconomic status. Because at the end of the day, regardless of those other factors, the access and other issues of people and having it generalizable really often comes down to a socioeconomic issue.
Yeah. Would real world data include asking how this drug affects your day-to-day life? And what I'm thinking about is for women with infertility or IVF, they have to stick all this progesterone in their vagina, and these are just suppositories. Like, I mean, I had a yeast infection 2 months ago, and I got asked my fiance, I said, go out, get me some Monistat. He came home, he said, here it is, use it. And I said, oh no, I have to wait till I'm done working. He's like, why? And I'm like, oh, it's a mess. It's a mess, And so there's a lot of women who are literally laying down so that their medicine for their fertility treatment or their yeast infection or whatever can do its job. And yet I don't think that clinical trial people are asking, like, what activities of your children did you miss because you had to be laying down, or, how often were you driving and it, leaked throughout in your business clothes or something like that. Do you think that's a real world evidence question that would be gender and sex focused that should be included?
Yes, that is a question that I'll use a different conditional verb, could be included. The problem is, and I've learned this in my years of doing clinical research, is that when you sort of prescribe what needs to be collected, it gets almost unmanageable. That's one issue. But the second issue is, and we're doing this at Harbinger Health, the company I work for, if you ask whoever participates in it to give you access in a de-identified fashion, de-identified and data protected way to your medical record, you can go back and do that. You can collect those data, because I'm not smart enough to know everything that but that anyone knows about what's important. And also, my guess is, as much as you all know about women's health, there are probably things that you don't know. And this discovery part of these trials, these studies, will be enormously helpful so that the next generation of studies can ask the right questions. So I can't stress enough how aggregating those data together and potentially using AI and ML for discovery, what is important, what did relate to the outcomes that we care about. And really, the problem is, are the doctors in the EHR collecting the questions you're asking? Like, would a doctor ask that question? Do you have to lie down? Does it interfere with your work? What are you doing?
How is your sex life?
How's your sex? Well, right.
Women are rarely asked that. And yet we have so much sexual dysfunction. And yet Viagra is prescribed very easily. So it's like women need Viagra too, right? Right. Yeah.
So I think just by advocating for, I have great hope, Brittany, for the future, because we're having the conversation. And it starts with that. And, I'm not in your demographic, but 3 sisters, 2 daughters, granddaughter, I care very much about this, as I do about all.
Men should, right?
Well, right. And caring about each other is just, it's really important. And so I want everyone to be as healthy as possible, and I want us to explore it, and nothing should be taboo. We should just have the conversation.
Yep, that's right. I'll just keep waving my flag. Talk to me about vulvas with sex considered. I'll wear my uterus earrings. I'll just keep doing that. Well, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine before we move to what you're working on today, one of the things when I met you at South by Southwest that just blew my mind, and I was texting my team incessantly, was you and Deb talking about discovering that women were really the critical person to getting everyone vaccinated. It wasn't just convincing each individual, it was convincing the mom, and she would then convince everyone else. And I actually starkly remember, I don't know if it was you or Deb saying I think it was probably Deb, honestly, recalling her personality, who said that the number one factor for convincing a white man was his own mother to get a vaccine. And so tell us a little bit about that. Was that something that was like surprising to the FDA? Was that something you hired researchers to find out? And with that knowledge, what do we do moving forward?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it was an absolute pleasure, despite hard times, working with Deb and Bob Redfield and trying to figure out what was going on. We had a lot of private meetings, the doctors on the task force, about what, could we sift through the data and try to help the American people as best possible. And Deb was our leader on this. And we knew from, our own respective healthcare settings that women were the drivers of healthcare decisions. From the FDA's perspective, because of the political environment, but also the social environment, the divisions, we knew that there was a significant amount of vaccine hesitancy and that potentially vaccine uptake would be low. We also knew that the vaccine was the way out of it, and that we had to do everything we could to reassure people that we were following kind of rigorous approach and doing the best we could. So from the FDA perspective, we engaged women's groups, we engaged ethnic and racial minority groups, we engaged doctors groups about these issues, described the process, described what went into our vaccine guidance, which at the end of the day was what guided the sponsors, the Modernas and Pfizers of the world, to create their clinical trials and move in the way that they did. And so this was a really important issue. Now, it could be argued that we were wrong, but this issue of pregnancy, we had them exclude pregnant women from, because we didn't want to take that risk on behalf of pregnant. We just didn't know. But as you know, in any clinical trial, despite doing that, there will be a couple of % of women who are pregnant when they're in a clinical trial. It's not great, but you find it in retrospect and you use that as an opportunity to study that. So we did a couple of things. One is we engaged communities like Academy of OBGYN, et cetera. We talked to people about what they thought was important from a healthcare point of view. And then when we got the complete data set, in real time, we could work with the sponsors about who to accrue what, et cetera. But then when we got the complete data set, we started to analyze to see if we could ask and answer some of these questions. Some we can't. Some had to be added on post-study surveillance or in the real-world studies. And we learned a lot more at that point. And that's what I mean. It's got to be an iterative process during an emergency, because you won't have all the data up front that you need. And so when a doc would call me and say, and I had lots of friends in the communities, what should I advise my pregnant patients? I said, look, we have limited data. And here's what we do know. And this is really a doctor-patient decision. But we'll have more data, X.
Yeah. Well, listeners, if you're a scientist or an engineer or just a avid fem fan, here's $1 billion idea for you. Someone please make an assay that you can put the drug on one side and then have a placental cell wall to see if it crosses over and affects the fetus. Another assay you can make is breast milk. Please, somebody make a breast milk, breast on a chip with milk ducts, put the drug on one side, and please tell us, does it come out into the milk on the other? Maybe that's a flagship pioneering next company. You can recruit me for that one, okay?
You bet.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not that, scientists and doctors are like, meh, pregnant women, meh, it's more like there is such an important risk that needs to be considered, and the lack of tools to do it safely and mindfully. And at the same time, there's such a sensitivity to pregnant women and babies. People are very sensitive about that. And not that we don't think that's an important thing, that, about 1,300 women per year dying in the United States from childbirth. But at the same time, there's 1,300 women in the United States dying every year from domestic violence, right? And like, we don't hear that as much or have that many conversations versus all the maternal, foundations there are, and walks and 5Ks and, so when you put babies and pregnant women in the story, all of a sudden it gets really charged. So it makes a lot of sense that the FDA had to move fast and decide which risks they needed to take.
Well, and Brittany, when you bring up kids, pediatric population, that was another very sensitive area, and it's for exact reasons that you described. And remembering, and if you're a guy in his 60s or a woman in her 60s, there's a defined period of time that person is likely to live. So the risk benefit ratio, and this sounds like a horrible, like a way to assess things, but when you're talking about, for example, even chemotherapy in kids, you're talking about hopefully a 40, 50 lifetime. And so the late effects just get magnified. They're not unimportant in adults, they're just different. Yeah. And so we had to do this in a sequential process. Now, it's not exactly the same because kids tended not to get sick unless they were immunosuppressed from COVID. Mm. So it was less of an issue. Yep. But pregnant women, these are really important ethical considerations, yeah, and they're not easy. And Brittany, what I love about what you're doing and your organization is doing, the only way we solve these ethical issues is to have a conversation, come to it with honesty and integrity, and try to get to the best answer. We may not always agree, but my guess is 95, 99% of the time, we're going to agree about doing the right thing for human beings.
Yeah. Well, what we like to do is point to the data, right? Obviously, I'm a very opinionated woman. I have a podcast. You can hear my opinion on that. But, at the end of the day, and we're always pointing back to the data because that's what you got to rely on.
Right. And where there isn't data, collect the data and analyze it.
That's right. Well, in our last few minutes here, I wanted to touch on the last part of our talk, which is talking about what you're working on now. So after leaving the FDA, you joined Flagship Pioneering, where ideas are incubated, tested, and grown. And Moderna actually came out of it. So we all know the name Moderna. Do you see sex being considered in the portfolio companies at Flagship? For example, you're working on Harbinger Health, which is a blood-based cancer screening test. Are you considering sex in your assays?
Absolutely.
Is that only since you met me in March, or?
No. So, I was part of something at Flagship called Preemptive Medicine and Health Security, and that's all about preempting disease. And some of the diseases that we're considering preempting are much more prevalent based upon a sex assessment of it in women, for example. Mm-hmm. And so it would be ridiculous scientifically and medically not to consider that. And so think about what we're doing, which is preemption in the cancer space. Our vision, our ambition is that there isn't any reason why we shouldn't be going to our doctor every year, in addition to our cholesterol, our wellness check, whatever that is for whatever specific circumstances you have, that you shouldn't also. So you should be asking about menstrual history, sex history, et cetera. You should be getting your cholesterol and your thyroid function tests, et cetera. But you also, we think, should be ultimately getting a blood-based approach test, a screen for cancer screening that then allows for identification of cancers early. We have a platform that's biologically based, and it's fascinating because it has very much to do with reproductive health. So when I was in the cancer world as an oncology fellow, and since that, everyone talked about how the creation of a human being, the placenta, the fetus, eventually the baby, the similarities in growth and development with what happens in cancer. Cancer being a very dysregulated process, usually with fetus, et cetera, placenta, it's a very organized process. And in fact, that's true. And those similarities can be based in biology, in genes, into what happens in the genome. And we have been able to access that to help us detect the presence of cancer. And there, we believe, will ultimately be gender differences in that, as well as racial and ethnic. So we're being very intentional about asking and answering those questions and making sure that we have adequate representation. Now, Breast cancer, only 1 in 10 breast cancer patients is male. So it's pretty straightforward to be able to do that. But other diseases, not so much, where there's a significant amount of underrepresentation. What's really fascinating, Brittany, about our trial is that we have a significant acceptance in our trial of women
Okay.
than men. So we actually have to think about correcting that as well, because we want to make sure we have a broad representation and that we're also, assessing the racial and ethnic diversity. But I have no doubt in my mind, like response to treatment, I talked about heart failure, et cetera, that there were going to be these differences that we have to explore, and we can't be afraid to talk about them.
Mhm.
And we can't be afraid to say these differences are real and they have to be used by physicians, providers, et cetera, to make the best decisions possible for people's outcomes. So our dream is to totally change the way cancer care is delivered, take the fear away from cancer, diagnose cancer stage 1, stage 2 predominantly before stage 1 or 2, and preempt that.
Yeah.
And we think we have the opportunity to do that.
What do you have a hypothesis as to why so many women are signing up for your trial?
I don't.
It'd be super interesting to look if maybe you're offering really convenient times, or like, I don't know if you're providing like childcare, or these are things that in the summit today, we will be discussing. Actually, the next panel is on clinical trial recruitment strategies for equal sex representation. So we'll get into it, but I wonder if what they're doing is something you maybe unknowingly are doing and are increasing your female participation.
Yeah, that's a really, I will go back to the team and talk about it, and actually be really interested in what suggestions come from the summit, because this won't be our first trial. It is our first trial, but it won't be our last trial. And we need to make sure that this isn't, just a fluke of some sort. I don't think it is. It's a really important part of what we're doing. At the end of the day, making sure that representation allows us to ask questions about biological insights into what's happening in the genome, what genes are turned off and on, and are they different in women and in men? And then also, what about underlying racial and ethnic minorities? Are different gene sets turned on? Because at the end of the day, that's going to ultimately guide clinical decision making and potentially even treatment. So that's an absolute obligation that we take seriously. The other thing that I want to just say to you is this whole thing about like being a cholesterol test. It has to be accessible to everybody. It has to be affordable for everybody. It can't cost $1,000. And we are paying a lot of attention to that part of accessibility so that it can be incorporated very inexpensively upfront. And when you think about uptake of mammography, cervical cancer screening, CT scan in high-risk individuals who smoke, and other accepted screenings for cancer, the penetration is it's not where it needs to be. I'll just say that. You have to go to a mammogram machine. You have to go to a person for a colonoscopy. You have to go for a CT scan. Most people are getting their blood drawn. It's a pretty easy thing. And adding another tube doesn't really matter that much. And at the end of the day, if we can get there and increase the accessibility and the number of people are screened, we can reduce something that is a passion of mine. Why are people diagnosed with late stage cancer? Why are they delaying coming in until it's too late? We have got to stop and preempt that.
Yep, that's right. We're going to also talk later today about medical gaslighting. Maybe that also has something to do with it, where patients, women in particular, have gone in maybe complaining of something, but being dismissed as, oh, you're just tired or anxious, or of course you have pain there, you're menstruating, right? And then that kind of delays it. But we'll pin that for a later panel. I did want to ask you, though, have you ever considered using the monthly menstrual blood that women release in their effluent as your blood test for this cancer test?
No, I haven't. I'm going to take that back to the team, because you probably know about some of these colon cancer screening tests, and no one ever thought about looking at DNA in stool. That is a fascinating and very interesting question, and there's probably a ton of insight there. All right. All right,
Steve, I'm coming on in as advisor. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Really appreciate it, Brittany. That actually is a really interesting idea.
Talk about accessibility. I got your blood sample. Like, and
there you go. There you go. I don't have to stick. Yeah, right.
There's actually a few femtech startups working on blood collection devices where it looks like a cup and you pull it out and it actually is medical grade collected, and that you could potentially send it in. So we're going to talk, Steve. Let's revolutionize this.
We
In
should.
our last minute here, what last words of advice do you have for our founders, our fem fans, our investors, people interested in women's healthcare, the future of how the government can help accelerate us? What can we do to convince the government to fund us more, to, approve more things, give us more fast track breakthrough designations? Like, what do you have any last words of advice for us as we try to really pioneer sex as a variable?
Yeah. Well, I think you've made a great start as far as I can tell. And what I think you need to do, and what you are doing, is really emphasizing the fact that there are data gaps that are affecting people in our world who deserve and need better healthcare. And we can look backwards and we can talk about why we don't have that, or we can look forward and say, hey, it's a new era. Everybody's important. We have to be inclusive. Here are some of the things that we think are important, and here are the voices of women that we feel need to be heard in terms of decision making, in terms of the very important things at this interface of health and policy. So I'd say you need to be advocates, you need to be at the table, and frankly, you need to crowdsource what's important to you and make sure that's known to the folks who make the policy decisions.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve, so much for your time today. It is lovely to have you here. I'm really impressed by your willingness to speak at the summit. To me, that says that women's health is important. When the former FDA commissioner says, yeah, I'll volunteer to come and keynote your summit. To me, yes, that is awesome for our organization. And I feel very proud of us in doing that, but I feel proud of our industry, because you can't get people of your caliber to willingly say, I'm going to try my best to be there to do this because I see the importance. To me, that is a signal that even at the highest rankings or inside the system, there is a churning and a stirring and a newness of sex is a variable. That's important. We need to invest in this. So thank you so much for your time today, Steve.
Well, thank you, Brittany. Keep up the great work. You should be proud of what you're doing. And congratulations to everybody on the summit.